Hey guys, what's up and welcome back to the Rocket Tub. My name is Philip and today we are touching on a pretty controversial and often discussed topic. Yep, today's video is about how NASA's Artemis program has become so ridiculously expensive. As always, the video is broken up into chapters with their respective timestamps on screen right now and down in the YouTube playbar. However, other than normally, I'm going to announce a quick disclaimer, which is that most of the numbers that will be presented over the course of this video are from early 2023 or 2022, since the current numbers haven't all been released yet. With all that said, let's start. By now, pretty much every one of you should have heard the name Artemis before. But for those of you who don't, here's a quick explanation. Artemis is the name of NASA's new lunar spaceflight program that is set to return humans to the moon by the late 2020s. To achieve this goal, NASA has spent several billions of dollars on a new crewed spacecraft, a carrier rocket, lunar landers, and loads of equipment. This includes the Orion Crew and Service Module, the mighty Space Launch System, the HLS variant of the SpaceX Starship, and many more. The first humans are set to return into a low lunar orbit as early as this year, and the next lunar landing, currently scheduled for the Artemis 3 mission, won't happen before 2026. On follow-up missions, NASA and partners are planning to install a small space station, the so-called Lunar Orbital Platform Gateway, or often just called Gateway, in a special orbit around the moon, and eventually even a base on the surface of the lunar South Pole later in the program. Currently, NASA is planning for at least 8 Artemis missions, 6 of which including landings on the lunar South Pole. But this video isn't primarily about the goals of the program or what technology is used to achieve them. It's about finances. As you've probably heard elsewhere before, the Artemis program has cost the United States a fortune. Although a fact, the debate whether NASA is wasting taxpayer money and whether it should even continue the program is often held on a basis of numbers and assumptions that often are just wrong. On the internet, heated debates are sadly fought without enough knowledge about what is and what isn't far too often. And since even the global journalism seems to catastrophically fail at the task of reporting on the finances behind Artemis correctly, it is time to shed some light into the dark. The first part of this video will be just the numbers and facts that are openly accessible through official statements by NASA and partners. Whenever something isn't fully clear, I will call it out so you don't get confused by some vague gap fillers that I may install here and there to get an accurate picture. In the second half, however, I'm going to give my own opinion on the topic and try to find some fixes for the obvious problems. Also, not all numbers have been disclosed, so this video pretty much resembles the situation from around about a year ago, but that may actually make the issue look less bad. But first, let's get ourselves some numbers. How much has Artemis actually cost? Where has the money been spent, and why is it so much? Solving the exact costs of spaceflight programs is no easy task, since they typically are funded through yearly budgets and not the actual amount spent, and it's often unclear where exactly the money even goes. Artemis certainly isn't an exception here. Therefore, getting exact numbers on a precise picture of the actual money flow isn't the easiest task in the world. And that's partially why I've tried to do it, so please forgive me if I made any mistakes here. First of all, we may have to define which areas of spending even count into Artemis and which don't. After all, Artemis reuses designs, research and even hardware from older programs like the Space Shuttle and the cancelled Constellation program. For this video, I will count everything into Artemis that is actually used during the missions of the program. This includes SLS, Orion, the HLS, spacesuits and other equipment, as well as launch infrastructure. The total program cost will be made up of development, production and operational costs of these sub-programs. This doesn't include things like the Artemis support missions, the Lunar Gateway Station or any of the previous efforts that didn't translate over into Artemis, since these are funded through their own individual programs and are not considered a direct part of Artemis. Orion, however, which started development under the Constellation program, is considered a direct part of Artemis, including every single dollar spent on it, since it is being used on the Artemis missions. So these are the things NASA has spent money on throughout the Artemis program. But how much money exactly went where? The most prominent spending factor of Artemis is the Space Launch System, the Super Heavy Carrier rocket that launches the Orion spacecraft and its crew to the Moon. Although derived from research done during the Constellation program and reusing parts from the Shuttle era, SLS has still cost a full $27 billion only to develop and fly once. That money has been distributed to the uncountable subcontractors of SLS, mainly Boeing, Aerojet Rocketdyne, Northrop Grumman and many others. These costs only include research, development and production costs of the first SLS to ever be built, as well as parts for up to 3 more rockets. However, the operational costs of the Space Launch System are actually insane. NASA currently expects that each and every SLS launch, of which at least 8 are currently accounted for, will cost about $4.1 billion. Although this number may go down to about $2.5 billion over time due to perfecting production and testing procedures as well as the economy of scale, this doesn't only make SLS the most expensive rocket to date, but also means that SLS alone could cost NASA another $30 or so billion throughout the rest of the program. The start of the development process for Orion goes back all the way to the year 2006, since it was initially set to ride on top of the Ares rockets of the Constellation program. After the cancellation of the Ares rockets, Orion has been transferred over to the SLS program and has seen heavy development and even flight testing in the meantime. Orion consists of 3 different parts: the command module designed and manufactured by Lockheed Martin, the European Service Module by ESA, and the launch abort tower provided by Orbital Sciences. Altogether, the development costs of Orion are stated to be $26.298 billion in the year 2022. This excludes the cost of the first service module, which were taken over by ESA, the assembly and integration costs which run on NASA's ground operations project, and of course, future production cost. It is expected that Orion will require annual funds of around $1.4 billion to test, maintain and operate the spacecraft, and a further $400 million to integrate SLS and Orion for each flight. Again, the ground infrastructure and its maintenance costs are excluded in this figure. So even without all the supporting stuff, Artemis has already cost $53 billion for just the launch vehicle and the spacecraft on top. But to successfully get SLS and Orion off the ground, NASA had to spend a bunch of money on ground infrastructure. That mainly consists of work around the Vehicle Assembly Building, or VAB, and Launch Complex 39B, since production lines and facilities are covered by the development contracts of their respective parts. Sadly, not all of the cash flow into the Exploration Ground Systems program can really be fit into numbers, since there are just too many parties involved which all have their very own contracts. Luckily, the major spending points of the ground infrastructure costs are known and make up quite a high percentage of the total cost for ground systems. And that part are the 2 mobile launch towers. See, SLS isn't really launched off the pad itself, but rests on top of a mobile launch platform instead. These are built upon a massive crawler that can move around very slowly and transport the rocket from the VAB to the pad and, if needed, back. Since 2 of these crawlers already exist from the Apollo era, NASA only had to retrofit them with new hardware to support SLS and 2 new launch support towers. And despite these towers only being steel constructs with a few pipes, cables and quick disconnect ports, the first and now operational launch tower has cost $927 million, and the second one, still under construction, is expected to reach the $1.5 billion mark. Considering there is more smaller hardware being funded through the Exploration Ground Systems contract, it is likely to have exceeded a total cost of around $3 billion already. But of course, Artemis requires a lot of assets in space as well as around the moon as well to bring astronauts to the surface of Earth's companion. That includes spacesuits, a lunar lander, and all sorts of surface equipment such as rovers, tools, and experiments. Again, some parts of the funding for the individual programs is almost unfindable, but we can get a good idea through the figures that we do know. One of those are the new Artemis spacesuits, developed by the space tourism company Axiom Space, who have been awarded $228.5 million for the program. That funding, however, was awarded in 2022, meaning overruns in the future are more than likely. The major spending point of the space assets are the lunar landers developed by commercial partners. Originally, NASA planned to select 2 different lunar lander designs by 2 different competitors, but due to funding issues they down-selected to just one contract that went to SpaceX for an adapted Starship variant in the end. The cost of the Starship HLS project has been determined at almost exactly $3 billion. Of which an unknown part has already been paid. Oddly enough, US government officials weren't particularly happy about using Starship exclusively and demanded NASA to select a second option as well, which happened in 2023 with Blue Origin receiving another $3.4 billion contract for their own lunar lander design, meaning the HLS contract alone is worth a full $6.4 billion already. Other than suits and landers, we don't really know what else money has flown in. There have to be multiple other projects for rovers and equipment going on, but these tiny contracts are well hidden and sometimes aren't even included into the Artemis program itself. One of those is the Commercial Lunar Payload Services program, which provides tiny satellites and robotic landers collecting data about the landing site at the moon. This program, which can both be counted as a part of Artemis or a standalone program, has cost a further $2.6 billion. So, to sum all these numbers up, NASA has, at least per our definition of what is part of Artemis and what isn't, spent a total of at least $61.598 plus minus $2 or $3 billion on the program already. That is a big chunk of money. And Artemis certainly isn't going to get any cheaper in the near future. Due to SLS and Orion being expected to both fly in an expendable configuration exclusively, each Artemis mission will bring along $5 to $6 billion in hardware production costs alone, not considering mission-specific equipment and future development costs. Actually, NASA plans to develop SLS even further and wants to introduce 2 block upgrades over the course of the Artemis program, meaning there are going to be even more development costs. NASA officials have already stated that Artemis might cost close to $100 billion until 2025 or 26, meaning NASA is expected to spend around $30 to $40 billion just in the next 3 years, and looking at the cost so far, this number is pretty realistic. Since Artemis is currently scheduled to have at least 8 missions throughout the 2020s and early 2030s, the final cost of the Artemis program is almost certainly going to exceed the $100 billion mark and may even cross the $150 billion. And the funding of Artemis doesn't even include things like the Gateway space station, which is going to be pretty expensive as well. Furthermore, NASA is looking towards constructing a permanent lunar base during the later stages of Artemis and increase the flight schedule, so Artemis could end up at more than triple the amount it has already cost. Next, it may be helpful to understand where all those costs actually came from. In terms of funding, Artemis behaves a lot like many previous spaceflight programs, as it's governmentally funded through the United States defense budget. But since NASA couldn't afford another Apollo-esque program costing hundreds of billions of dollars, they set up Artemis to be a lot more sustainable and cheaper than all the other previous NASA programs. To achieve that, the basic policy of Artemis demands the reuse of components from multiple other programs. Most predominant are, of course, parts from the Space Shuttle and Apollo eras. Furthermore, NASA was required by the US Senate to work together with the commercial sector for support missions and the Human Landing System. All of that was supposed to lower the cost of the Artemis program dramatically. However, Artemis isn't even remotely close to what it was supposed to cost. Considering that the Apollo program had cost around 330 billion of today's dollars, the price tag of a program that reuses existing hardware, all of the infrastructure left at Johnson, Kennedy and Stennis Space Center, and even some production lines shouldn't even come close to the one of Apollo. Yet, Artemis will manage to eventually reach at least half, if not 2/3 of the total cost of Apollo. All of this begs one important question. What the hell went wrong? Actually, there isn't a single reason why the Artemis program has ended up way more expensive than it should, but rather a chain of mistakes, practices, and pure miscalculations. Reason number one is a policy that initially should make Artemis cheaper. The design of SLS in particular is heavily influenced by the Artemis program being demanded to reuse parts from earlier programs. Not only is the general design of the core stage derived from the shuttle's external main tank, both the engines and the solid rocket boosters have actually been flown on various shuttle missions. However, redesigning all the components for a new vehicle and getting the reused hardware back to flight readiness has cost a lot more than NASA had hoped for. Reusing decades-old technology requires upgrades to fulfill modern safety standards and work together with the newer technology used on the same vehicle. And when you're trying to update components from the space shuttle, which literally were designed and partially even built back in the 1970s and 80s to the standards of the 2020s, the process requires so much work that the reused parts end up being almost as expensive as newly designed and manufactured ones. And if that wasn't enough, the newly developed elements of SLS were forced to reuse older components and operate together with ancient shuttle technology, which poses additional problems and requires more effort than the development process normally should. All in all, the reuse of these older components doesn't decrease the costs even remotely, but instead only causes unnecessary problems and costs that no one needs. And keep in mind, all of the reused components aren't actually reused again. The hardware that is reused from earlier programs is just expanded on each and every single flight and has to be reproduced for later missions. That means we are actively reactivating production lines for outdated hardware just so we can reuse some of them that we have lying around for the first few flights. I think you can see how this does in fact negatively impact the costs of developing a rocket like SLS. But that's not even everything that stands in the way of a cheap development for Artemis. And that is where reason number 2 comes in. NASA doesn't develop, build or operate all of its hardware used in the Artemis program themselves. In fact, most of the development and manufacturing has been outsourced to commercial partners and NASA substructures through governmental contracts. These are typically awarded to traditional partners of NASA like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman or Aerojet Rocketdyne. That alone isn't really a problem in terms of high costs and overspends. But the contract model NASA used to award these funds isn't ideal at all. The agency awards so-called cost-plus contracts to its partners, a practice that directly leads to massive cost increases. Cost-plus contracts don't have an upper boundary for contractor spendings. The amount of money that NASA awards to companies for research and development is only a preliminary budget the contractor should but isn't forced to stay within. In other words, NASA will pay the contractors whatever amount of money they need. Now, just guess what's going to happen. Correct! None of the contractors will even try to comply with the initially awarded budget. If there is no need to stay within a given budget or spend as little as possible, every single contracted item is likely to become way more expensive than it has to be. Contractors can just claim money from NASA for their work without them even bothering, since the contract allows that. And knowing that some of the contractors, especially Boeing and their struggles over on the airplane side, do have some financial problems, it's easy to imagine what has happened here. Cost plus contracting actually causes the majority of the overspends and the delays on the Artemis program. And then there is reason number 3, the United States government. Since Artemis is a program initiated and led by NASA, the current administrations and the Congress have a lot to say when it comes to mission goals, funding, and as it turns out, even who the contractors are. And since the administrations change over time, politics can indeed mess a whole lot up. Since the humble beginnings of the Artemis program in 2010, the program has been through 3 different administrations with individual space policies. After all, SLS and Orion were initially set up for the crewed exploration of Mars, before the Trump administration shifted focus back to the moon. Luckily, the Biden administration has decided to not mess around with that. However, single elements have been added and removed from the program over its entire course. It isn't even that rare for the Congress or the President to directly mandate things causing the cost of Artemis to explode in certain areas. Take the Human Landing System, or HLS, for an example. Initially, NASA planned to go with 2 different lunar lander designs by 2 different commercial partners for redundancy. But since the Congress only granted NASA $3 billion in funding for the program, which probably isn't even enough to develop a single lunar lander, NASA decided to ditch the idea of 2 independent systems and instead handed a $3 billion contract over to SpaceX for their modified version of Starship, which was actually the cheapest proposal received. But the Congress, and especially the US Senate, didn't particularly like this decision, just ask Bernie Sanders, and demanded that NASA must pick a second option as well, with the Congress handing out additional funds for the second lander after all. And so the costs just exploded and ended up over double what it was initially set to cost. Such political factors have crossed NASA's plans many times before and probably will cause even more chaos in the future. And these are only the 3 main reasons why the price tag of Artemis is so much higher than it should really be. So we know what Artemis has cost and why it has been so expensive. But numbers alone aren't the most efficient way to process information. We need context. So, just how high are the costs of Artemis compared to other programs and other elements of our world? In case you've ever watched a video or read an article about the finances of the Artemis program before, you may already know what's about to come. Artemis is often criticized for costing too much and wasting money. But just how bad are the finances of Artemis really? Well, spoiler alert, they aren't really bad. They are straight up ridiculous. Let's start with the most well-known overpriced thing in the entirety of Artemis: the Space Launch System, the giant rocket that is set to carry astronauts to the moon. As we established earlier, the development of SLS has cost a total of $27 billion. That is a lot. In fact, that is more than SpaceX has spent on Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy, Dragon and Starship combined. But hey, NASA is governmentally funded. Maybe it isn't too fair to compare SpaceX with Artemis. But SLS has already cost more than 54% of the total Saturn V program in the 60s and 70s. And the money spent on the Saturn V program includes a few things that aren't included in the cost of SLS. If we only consider research, development and production costs, the Saturn V had cost the American government around $35 billion in today's money. And that includes 13 launched vehicles. SLS is just 8 billion short of that and has only launched once. But the extremely high development costs of SLS are only the tip of the iceberg. Due to the production, integration and testing costs, SLS rocks an estimated price tag per launch of $4.1 billion. This number can't even really be compared to anything because it literally is the world record. Yep, SLS is the most expensive launch vehicle ever flown, beating the Saturn V by a factor of almost 2. Just to get a better feeling for this number, in its current form, the Space Launch System is capable of carrying 27 tons to a translunar injection orbit. But for the same amount of money, NASA could buy Falcon Heavies that carry around 20 tons to the same orbit each and cost $150 to $200 million in expendable configuration. That equals at least 20 Falcon Heavy launches for the same cost as one SLS, and therefore a total payload capacity of more than 400 tons instead of just 27. You now may, rightly so, ask why on earth SLS has become this expensive, and to be honest, even I don't have a clue. But looking at the production contracts given out by NASA, you have to wonder what went wrong here. For example, Aerojet Rocketdyne, the manufacturer of the RS-25 engines used on the core stage of SLS, was paid a whopping $1.7 billion just to refurbish a few already existing engines and restart the production lines that still existed. For later production engines, NASA has agreed to purchase these engines for $146 million apiece. That means one engine of the core stage is about as expensive as manufacturing, testing and launching an entire Falcon Heavy. And SLS has 4 of these engines. And these overpriced components certainly don't end here. The 2 solid rocket boosters are purchased from Northrop Grumman for $900 million per pair of SRBs, meaning around $450 million per unit. Again, this equals another 4 to 5 Falcon Heavies just for the 2 boosters. And each SRB is way smaller, less capable and simpler than the entire SpaceX rocket. Additionally, the SRBs have cost $2.4 billion just to refurbish the old SRB hull segments from the shuttle era and modify them for SLS. Yes, you heard that right. The solid rocket boosters used on SLS already existed, but cleaning and slightly modifying them has somehow ended up costing almost $2.5 billion. But the probably worst part about SLS is the core stage production and development by Boeing. Just for development, production and testing of 2 test articles, the total cost of this process has somehow reached $6.7 billion. Boeing has managed to design and produce 2 first stages, which are essentially just tanks without engines, for the same price it took SpaceX to design, test and certify Falcon 9 and Dragon. And then there would still be enough money left for a couple of flights. Isn't that just ridiculous? But hey, it can't get any worse than a $4.1 billion launch vehicle, right? Well, prepare yourselves for even more ridiculous stuff. The launch support infrastructure, or more precisely, the 2 mobile towers. These 3 constructions are what houses fuel lines, quick disconnect ports, umbilicals and data links supporting the launch of SLS. Mounted on top of one of 2 specially designed crawler vehicles, these mobile launchers carry SLS from its assembly in the VAB to a launch pad and then also launch it. You want to know how much they cost? Well, the first one, used during Artemis 1, has cost NASA $1 billion. And this doesn't even include the enormous crawler platform. No, these were already used for the shuttle and Apollo launches as early as the 1960s. The only thing NASA had to do was modifying them and construct a new steel tower on top of them. And somehow, this simply gantry tower has ended up costing a full $1 billion. To put that into perspective, NASA's about 100-meter tall steel tower with a few pipes and cables has cost almost half as much as the Burj Khalifa, the literal tallest skyscraper on planet Earth. That is a lot. But to make things even worse, the extreme delays in development of the exploration upper stage have led to the construction of a mobile launch tower that can only support launches of the Block 1 variant of SLS. So, the ML1, on which NASA has spent $1 billion already, will be obsolete after just 3 launches, and NASA will need a second mobile launch tower that is just a few meters taller to handle the exploration upper stage. And do you want to know how much the ML2 project is set to cost? Right, the second launch tower will be even more expensive than the first one at over $1.5 billion. So, there you have it. NASA's 2 steel towers together have cost more money than the tallest building ever constructed. Wow! And not at least because of these numbers, the less dramatic failures of the Artemis funding processes aren't even spotlighted as much. Just look at the Orion crew module. The development and testing costs for this capsule, that probably isn't even absolute top-of-the-notch technology anymore already, has also cost a whopping $26 billion so far. And Orion has only ever flown twice. If we compare the development costs of Orion to the only 2 at least somewhat operational American crewed spacecraft, the Boeing Starliner and SpaceX Crew Dragon, we quickly see that Orion has cost more than both of them combined. Yes, Orion had to switch the rocket it was set to ride on multiple times, and even the design goals for the spacecraft changed drastically early in its development, and it is, other than SpaceX and Dragon, designed for deep space exploration. These factors may have driven Orion's development costs into the astronomical, but over $26 billion still seems like it should have been a lot less. Well, that is enough rant for today. As you may have noticed by now, Artemis is way over budget and the costs have run into ridiculousness in some areas. But although mistakes have been made and billions of taxpayer money may have been practically wasted, NASA has actually begun to understand how to avoid future overspends on Artemis and other future programs. So, how could this immense problem possibly get fixed? Fixing Artemis and other future programs by NASA is actually surprisingly easy. But since we can't really fix things in the past, staying within the initial cost estimates of Artemis is already impossible. Yet, NASA can learn from the disaster class the Artemis contract awarding and funding processes have been. The most glaring issue with Artemis is a practice of cost-plus contracting. Since this contract model has been used pretty much everywhere, NASA couldn't really keep track of how much money went where. Since dozens of partners were basically allowed to take as much money and time as they'd like, the cost of Artemis skyrocketed. By simply getting rid of cost-plus contracting and replacing it with fixed-cost contracts, which award a predetermined budget that can't be surpassed unless there is a dramatic change in design goals or something a contractor can't control complicates the process, we can easily limit the amount of money spent in certain areas. And by just checking in on the development processes and financial situation of these processes now and then, NASA could easily keep track of where exactly the money is spent and identify potential funding issues or future overspends way ahead of them actually happening. It could be this easy. And, quite surprisingly, NASA seems to have learned from their mistakes already. Just look at the latest contract that was awarded around Artemis, the Human Landing System development and demonstration contracts awarded to SpaceX and later Blue Origin. Other than past contracts, these are pretty much fixed cost contracts. SpaceX, for example, has been awarded $2.9 billion for their lunar lander development, and that is pretty much set in stone. And a few other contracts of smaller volume have already begun to use the same fixed cost model as well. The HLS contract with SpaceX also demonstrates quite well how additional funds are handled, seeing that NASA did award SpaceX a contract expansion of around $1.15 billion for inflation-adjusted development costs and a second lunar landing mission that wouldn't have fit in the budget otherwise. That comes alongside with now former NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine announcing in 2019 that NASA is planning to switch to fixed-cost contract models exclusively in the next couple of years. He even threatened Boeing executives to cancel their contracts and switch to commercial options instead should they overspend even more on the SLS core stage and Starliner. And surprisingly, that seems to have worked. But would that threat of Bridenstine actually be a viable option? Well, it depends. Not only would we have to find an option that is capable of doing the same job, but it would also have to be ready to fly humans to the moon in a similar time frame. The answer to that question is probably yesn't. It is both viable, but at the same time not. Basically, it all depends on one single launch system that has proven to be a total wildcard: Starship. Without Starship, there's almost no way to get any crew module to the moon. While it's certainly possible, launching one on the currently largest commercial rocket, SpaceX's Falcon Heavy, would not only require the type to get human rated, but would also severely limit the amount of payload that we can take to the moon. The best commercial option we may have by 2026, which is the currently aimed for launch window of Artemis 3, would be a combination of multiple vehicles in an all-SpaceX mission. A crew of 4 astronauts would launch on board a Crew Dragon spacecraft riding atop a Falcon 9 and end up in a high-altitude, low-Earth orbit. There, the capsule would dock to a HLS variant Starship, already waiting fully equipped and refueled in orbit. After transferring the crew into Starship, the Dragon spacecraft would separate again and wait in orbit for the Starship's return. The crew would then be taken to the moon by Starship, land there, conduct surface operations, and return to the initial Earth orbit on board one and the same Starship HLS variant. At last, the two vehicles would have to dock again for the Crew Dragon to take the astronauts back to Earth. In terms of costs, the entire mission could easily be done within the cost of launching a single SLS, including every single bit of equipment used. If we also account for development costs, the entire mission with the two vehicles used would still end up cheaper than the SLS program alone and maybe even stay below $10 to $15 billion. Actually, there are just 3 slight issues with an all-commercial Artemis mission. Firstly, large parts of the desired mission infrastructure are unproven and not guaranteed to be operational in a similar time frame. Especially Starship can't really be trusted to function to full extent by them, although the actual Artemis infrastructure has the very same issue. Secondly, it isn't guaranteed that Starship can even transfer a crew from low Earth orbit to the moon, land there and return them all the way back to Earth. That entire mission profile requires a lot of Delta V, and we may not even have all that available, which could complicate the entire thing a lot more. And of course, switching the entire mission infrastructure after having spent more than $60 billion on SLS on Orion already is just stupid. Going for an all-commercial Artemis 3 mission right now would mean years of development and billions of dollars wasted. The decision to switch would have had to be made years earlier. But although NASA can't really get rid of the overpriced hardware now, they're trying to commercialize as much of the Artemis program as possible. The HLS program was meant to cooperate with commercial partners since pretty much the beginning, but other contracts like the Artemis spacesuits were initially developed by non-commercial partners but were transferred due to cost overruns and painful delays. As you can probably see, there are some pretty straightforward ways to fix Artemis, and NASA is actually trying to do it. But that all just comes way too late. Now that the mistakes have already been made and billions of dollars have been spent, applying these fixes and saving Artemis is nearly impossible. But there are signs of hope. After all this criticism, I want to make one thing clear. I in fact do support Artemis. I think that SLS is a very cool looking rocket, and something like it is a required capability for lunar missions. I do enjoy watching Artemis unfold, and I hope NASA achieves all the program goals of Artemis. But I also believe that all of this could have been done for a lot less money. In the pursuit of greatness, NASA failed to keep an eye on the associated costs. For a program that is supposed to be sustainable and way cheaper than previous programs, Artemis has cost quite a lot, and at least in that goal, failed dramatically. Loose policies, an ancient contract model that is overdue to be replaced, and a lack of oversight have led to Artemis wasting billions of dollars of taxpayer money. And while NASA has certainly lost control over their spendings on Artemis, the real ones in fault are the renowned government contractors, longtime partners like Boeing, Aerojet Rocketdyne and Northrop Grumman, and others simply didn't care if they overspent, since NASA allowed them to. But there's light at the end of the tunnel. NASA appears to have learned their lessons and have begun to change the flawed policies inside the agency. In just a few years, cost-plus contracting will be a thing of the past and make way for more modern models that keep an eye out for potential overspends to avoid them way ahead. NASA has also begun a more extensive cooperation with the commercial sector to reduce costs, which actually forces the traditional NASA partners to become more efficient on their own to stay competitive with the commercial sector. The Artemis program is a financial failure, but one NASA has actually learned from. The mistakes made and the resulting lesson learned set us up for better chances of succeeding when we eventually reach for Mars in the future. Artemis will go on and hopefully achieve its goals, but that won't change the fact that behind the scenes a lot has gone wrong and the program costs have risen into the ridiculous ranges. But luckily, there is light at the end of the tunnel, and it is approaching fast. And that's it for my analysis on why the Artemis program has become so insanely expensive. Leave a comment below on what you think went wrong, and if you enjoyed the video, which I really hope you did, why don't you hit the like button and subscribe to the Rocket Top. I really appreciate your support. We see ourselves in the next video, and until then, I'm out. Cheers!